One of the most common topics in IELTS Writing Task 2 is children. And you can see from these example Task 2 questions that even though the questions themselves may not be specifically about children, child or a synonym of child still often appears. For this reason, then, it's very important for you to be able to paraphrase child or children accurately and confidently. This leads me to one of the most common errors I notice students make in writing task 2, which is paraphrasing child incorrectly. I think they try to use another word that they think means something pretty much the same, but actually it doesn't, and so it changes the meaning of what it is they want to write, and perhaps more importantly, does not address the IELTS question accurately enough, which is an issue for Band 7 in task achievement. In this lecture, then, we're going to look at a variety of paraphrases and synonyms of child, and we're going to study exactly what they mean and when they can be used, so that by the end of the lecture, you can be confident in paraphrasing child. So, okay, let's get cracking. So let's have a look at some paraphrases of child. First, we have a child, a young child, a youngster, a youth, a teenager or an adolescent, they're the same thing, a kid, offspring or young, they're pretty much the same too, and an infant. So now I'm going to show you some definitions, and I want you to choose the most appropriate option, the most appropriate paraphrase from the table to match the definition. So here's the first one. A person who is not yet an adult, i.e. under 18 years old, according to UK law, 18 years old or older is an adult. This word also implies someone older than 2 years old, as children younger than this are more often referred to as infants or babies, depending on their age. So pause the video and choose one of the paraphrases, the most appropriate one to fit this gap. Okay, let's have a look then. A child. Sure, a child is a bit of a legal term, really. Like I say in this definition, under 18 years old, as according to UK law. So yes, a 17-year-old is a child, a 1-year-old is a child, a 5-year-old is a child. They're all children. Like I also say in this definition, though, if you're referring to a child who is like 2 years old or younger, they are technically children, but we'd more often use a different word to describe that kind of child, like infant or baby. So let's move on. Let's look at the other words. The next definition. This is an exact synonym for child, but it is too informal for task 2 writing. You can, however, use it in the speaking test. Pause the video, choose a paraphrase. Okay, let's have a look. A kid. This is a very typical, very common mistake that I notice in essay writing. A lot of people like to use kids as a paraphrase of children in their essays, but it really is way too informal for essay writing, so you can't use it. This is understood to mean a child who is younger than a teenager but older than a baby or infant, between 3 and 12 years old, approximately, shall we say. Okay. A young child. Technically, I suppose a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old could also be called a young child, but like I mentioned before, it would be a bit awkward, a bit unnatural. We'd more likely use a different word. Okay. A child aged from birth until about 2 years old. Okay. An infant. I think we talked about this enough, so I think you probably know that was the answer. So yeah, we call them an infant. A teenager or young adult, early 20s. But this word often also has derogatory connotations. So yes, it has this word has implications that this kind of person is bad, that there's something wrong. Is perhaps a bit offensive, you could say. Okay. A youth. This is another common mistake that I notice students make, and this is particularly with youth, the countable noun. Youth, the uncountable noun, is something a bit different, but in a countable form, it has derogatory connotations, is a bit kind of offensive to the young people. Like you can have a sentence that is something like, my elderly neighbor is often harassed by youths. Like that's kind of how the word is used, like not in a nice way for describing these people. So yeah, watch out for that. These are usually used when referring to animals' children. They could be used for people's children if you are referring to them in the same sense as animals. This could be appropriate in Task 2 questions about wildlife or the environment, for example, where you may be comparing humans with animals. Otherwise, these words are very unnatural when applied to people. Okay. Offspring and young. Sure, this is a very common mistake I've noticed as well. I read sentences like, mothers should be responsible for their offspring's education, or mothers should take the initiative with their young's work lives. It is so awkward and really unnatural. Doesn't work well at all. But you can use these words in some other contexts, like, for example, the motherly instinct to protect one's young is prevalent in humans as well as animals. That, or with offspring, would be great, would be perfectly fine. So yeah, watch out for that. This is the closest synonym to child. It means a child or young person, anyone over the age of about 2 years old and under 18. Okay. A youngster. A 19-year-old, a youngster? Not really. It's more used for people who are children. A 2-year-old, a 3-year-old? Yeah, sure, they could be called youngsters too. Okay. This is a child aged from 13 to 19 years old. It can only be a teenager or adolescent. Yes, clues in the word. Teenager. So 13, 14, 19. 12? No. The ages with teens in them is a teenager, and an adolescent is the exact same meaning. This is also a common mistake. Maybe you have an IELTS question which is asking about children, and in your introduction you paraphrase children with teenagers. No, teenagers means something different, means a very specific kind of child, and quite an old child, really. So that can't be used. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the word youth, because this is a bit of a complicated word, really. So the first definition is youth, the countable noun. Like I mentioned before, a teenager or a young adult, often in a derogatory way. For example, I'm sick of youths playing football outside my house. So yeah, it's the meaning of this word. It's usually used to say something kind of bad about these kinds of people. We look at the second definition, which is the youth as an uncountable noun. And this means teenagers and young adults in general. So not a specific youth who you can see, or a specific group of youths that you see in a particular area, but these kinds of people in general. For example, the youth these days think they know everything. So yeah, I'm talking about teenagers and young adults generally, any and all of them in this sense. In his youth. Again, using an uncountable noun, this is referring to when the person was a teenager or a young adult. For example, I used to go sailing with my dad in my youth. Basically means the same as when I was young. When I was a young adult, when I was a teenager, that's when I did it. Okay, so that's all there is for the word youth, and we're finished with child as well. I hope by now you feel a lot more confident about paraphrasing child and knowing how to use this word in your essays. To summarize, the most exact synonym to child is youngster. All the other paraphrases are more specific or can only be used in particular contexts, and so you have to bear that in mind when you're writing your essays.